come right in almost all relevant settings, a kind of oscillation between authoritarian forms and in some sense, democratic forms. The oscillation period describes the cycle can be very short, or in some cases can be very long, and the results, of course, in each instance can be different. Obviously, the term cycle is already misleading. It seems to imply a return to the same. And I think it is going to be clear in this course that the cycle produces new versions of what came before. So let's take, which one of you am I going to pick on right off the bat? It's hard with Iran. It's kind of hard with Iran, but I think it probably could be done. Let's just state it with the Chilean case, which we'll deal with on Wednesday. In some clear sense, constitutional order was restored after 1988, but the constitutional system is not the same in 1988 as it was certainly in the Allende period, or even in the previous versions of constitution in Chile. There are several, even in that case. So cycle cannot mean return to the same. And authoritarianisms, probably you could tell me, are each time also different. New authoritarianism that emerges. This is going to be particularly interesting for us now, because the authoritarian forms that we're going to be dealing with in the age of backsliding or de-democratization are different than the authoritarian forms that existed before. Hungary, let's say, my country, has had plenty of authoritarian episodes, but none is like the current Orban or Fidesz regime. Is it a regime? At least, I think it is a hybrid regime of some kind. So cycle obviously does not mean in either case of democracy to return to the same. So we could talk about oscillation. We could even talk about spiral. We could use different metaphors, but cycle is the one that I chose, and I could now be stuck with it because my courses, this one and the next one, are going to use that particular term. Now, two errors I want to start with. One made by O'Donnell and Schmitter in their book on transition, and one made by me last time. Let me start with them. They argue in their transition volume that the road from dictatorship to democracy and the road from democracy to authoritarianism are completely different. They're not symmetrical. And whereas they tend to think that some kind of deterministic model can be used for collapse of democracies. We'll see whether that works for Chile or not next time. Valencia actually denies it in its text. Certainly, there is some plausibility in that particular case, because authoritarian actors are able to produce an outcome which in some sense, at least in the short term, is relatively certain or relatively determined. What O'Donnell and Schmitter say is for democratic actors impossible. So the transition from authoritarian to democracy is as unpredictable as democracy itself, and probably for the same reason. A variety of actors, they are contending for one another, different social goals, distant project, contend, and the outcome which is sometimes even restored authoritarianism, cannot be predicted. I'd like to disagree with this and just modify it to an extent to make it more right. I would say that yes, there is lack of symmetry, but the components are the same, except that they are reversed in order. Whereas in the case of an existing democracy, it is the beginning period in which democratic actors contended one another. Think about already, we're going to look at the Chilean case. Various actors who are committed or partially committed to democracy are in conflict, and so the results are unpredictable. It is the next stage, the actual transition stage, which becomes, to some extent, logically structured and, if not fully determined, at least more deterministic. In the case of transition from dictatorship to democracy, at least in their scheme, O'Donnell Schmitter's scheme, it is authoritarian actors who tend to commence the process by reforms from above. And that part of the process is fairly predictable. But once democratic actors are released, once they act on the terrain, start acting on the stage, unpredictable results. So I would say that even if the two types of processes, breakdown of authoritarianism, breakdown of democracy, are not fully symmetric, their components are to an important extent the same. So that's one error that I wanted to avoid because it's important for the course, since we'll be using many of the same categories to describe both types of processes. I want to now correct an error I made last time. Come right in. No. You come and go as you want. An error I made last time, and it actually even has to do with the structure of the two courses, the fall and the spring. I used the expression, the fall will mostly describe the cycles, and the spring will try to explain it. You heard me say that. I think I have to modify that, and in fact, say a mea culpa in my own name, because we can't get away from explanation or causality, even in this part of the course. In particular, what we'll be talking about this session and next, we'll be actually explaining how actors, their intentions, their forms of organization, and the alliances they make cause, in the case of this set of two sessions, breakdown of democracy. So there's causality there. Now, the way I would like to save myself, at some extent, try to save O'Donnell and Schmitter's idea of lack of symmetry too, the way I'd like to save myself, and this is going to be central for these sessions, is to distinguish between long-term, middle-term, and short-term causation. I don't know if any of you had a chance to take a look at our book on populism and civil society. It's not required reading, although maybe I assigned it at some point here, but certainly hasn't been a required reading for people to come into the class. But in that text, we try to talk about three levels of causation which are relevant to populist challenges to various versions of constitutionalism: the long term, the short term, the middle term. And the idea, to some extent, is one that you will find in a Marxist literature. You will find it in an indirect way in Juan Linz's writings too, and an idea that will be relevant to this class. Now, to a Marxist, obviously, if you wanted to explain the causes of the eventual replacement of capitalism, you could talk about the fundamental contradiction of the capitalist order, right? between socialization of production and at the same time privatization of distribution and rewards and incomes. They're fundamental contradictions which Marx might even take back to the wage labor capital relationship. That is always present in every capitalist society in the way Marxists see things. But that is the fundamental structural feature of all capitalist societies. I think you all read some Marx to know that. You also know that Marx is a theorist of crisis, right? The fundamental contradiction is always there, but you cannot say that capitalism is always in crisis, right? Crises are cyclical events in his depiction, which occur for a variety of reasons. He has worked on it for several volumes, worth of his writings, whether it's disproportionality or whether it is the changing organic composition of capital. Well, it doesn't matter for us here. These reasons produce periodic crisis. Overproduction is another model for Marx. Lorenzo Luxemburg would add underconsumption too. These are all different Marxian crisis theories, and they produce crisis only sometimes, periodically. That's the middle range. When you finally get to whether with Rosa Luxemburg to collapse or with others to revolution, then you enter into the very short term. Not every crisis produces collapse. Not every crisis produces a revolution. In fact, strictly speaking, in the 19th century, none did. In the 20th century, one can discuss, in some cases, the Russian-German case, where the revolutionary processes emerged from this long and the middle term tensions inherent to the system. I would adopt that view, except not in a Marxian version. I would say, at this stage, we say in our populism book, that modernity has three fundamental contradictions. One of them is the one Marx analyzed. It has to do with the disjuncture between production and distribution. But beyond Marx, we also suggest that there are cultural and political built-in crises in the modern world as well. From a political point of view, we insist on the tension between popular sovereignty and constitutionalism, which we isolate then as the ultimate cause of the populist challenges that emerge. And I think one can also add to that to the list a cultural dimension in which the tension between nation and political order represents another possible place of rupture, contestation, and the production of crises. I would say that it is this that in the long term has to be analyzed in terms of a topic like the breakdown of democracies, or indeed the transformations of authoritarian forms of rule, because each one of these tensions is capable of producing not only crises but also forms of political mobilization and political contestation. Now, in order to see how this works for us through the literature that we're going to be examining, it is the term crisis or political crisis that is going to become central. I was playing in my mind whether, for the sake of this discussion, we should ask you to read a book on crisis, and Habermas's book, Legitimation Crisis, would have been the one. But then I realized that it works poorly for this particular class, because although he talks about political crisis phenomena, the dimension of political crisis, which is most relevant here, is indeed left on, and that is something to do with the crisis of party systems. You'll see throughout this class, throughout the first third of these sessions, that crisis of party systems play a significant role in democratic breakdown, and that is certainly possible to show in our discussion of Chile a couple of sessions, a couple of days from now. But political party systems represent a domain which are, of course, sensitive not only to tensions between democracy and constitutionalism, which I mentioned already, but also economic and cultural phenomena, tensions which exist in a given society. Which of them will be the most important, I think, will depend on the case. But whatever we say about an individual case, we will have to treat the crisis of political orders, and particularly the tensions of existing party systems, the existing the tensions between constitutional structures and parties, the consequences of economic deprivation and economic challenge, and political parties as central for our discussion. Let me turn to the actual reading, and all I wanted to do so far is to correct whatever misimpression you may have got from a previous remark of mine that we're not going to be dealing with causal phenomena during this first part of the course. We are going to be dealing with an argument that has a causal dimension, but it will not be the whole of that causality. Juan Linz and Alfred Stepan, Arturo Valenzuela too, in his text on Chile, have raised this question with respect to economic dysfunction, economic crisis phenomena, economic challenges, and so on. And each one of them, and I think this is still indicates the power of Marxist thought, Marxist history of ideas in, first of all, a lot of Latin America, but in much of the world, perhaps least of all in the United States, is that they have to raise the question of whether the crises that occur in political systems leading to breakdown are economically caused, ultimately economically caused. You already see in terms of my scheme, the economic contradictions play a role, but so do political and cultural ones. But they raise this issue from point of view of debates with lots of Marxist colleagues or colleagues who are influenced by Marx. I don't know how many of you had read the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. It's a central text here, although I don't think that either Linz or Valenzuela or Stepan refer to it explicitly. They treat the Marxian tradition as one, and as a result, they don't give the other side the best of all possible statement that they could have. economic crisis, how do they produce the breakdown of a political system? What is supposed to happen? Economic challenges. How do they produce authoritarianism? Right? I mean, somehow they imply that to their Marxist debating partners, they do, but they don't explain how the other side would explain it. But Marx provided an explanation, right? Economic tensions, economic crises, economic inequality, the wage labor capital relationship and all its consequences produce a larger and larger class of labor. It's not a paradox of capitalist development, which will trace back to the economic contradictions that Marx had a funny term for these gravediggers, that the system as it develops produces a stronger and stronger gravedigger, right? The proletariat is supposed to be the product of capitalist development, and yet it is the agent that is going to undermine it or reverse. This is Marxism 101. Everybody kind of knows this, right? It's a very simple idea, but the political system intervenes into that, even in Marx's conception, because the political system means that as inherited either authoritarian or traditional systems are democratized, this class becomes stronger and stronger. Not only does it become larger and larger, but becomes more and more numerous. Since the 19th century was demonstrably a period of inclusion and of extension of suffrage, universal manhood suffrage, right? Women not voting in almost any place in the 19th century. But still, there's a dramatic expansion of suffrage. The point is that this is an ambiguity in Marxist concept of a revolution, but it's an ambiguity that leads to a tension between revolutionary and reformist Marxisms, that the growth of the proletariat and democratization processes could produce a reformist or a evolutionary transformation of existing capitalist systems. The proletariat is larger, it's getting the vote, it is allowed to organize, it is able then to create political parties, and these political parties will fundamentally reform the system if they're given a chance, if they become stronger, if the proletariat still grows, if they get alliances, whatever it is. And this is where Marx's own theory of authoritarian turn comes in, that before that happens, there's a response, namely a response which is based on the choice between either an eventual socialist outcome or the destruction of democracy. That's what Bonapartism is. Bonapartism represents an attempt in a democratic age to deprive increasingly the majority of the population from a democratic input, from the possibility of transforming the political world and the social world as well. This would be Marx's own linkage of capitalist development crisis, possibility of revolution, or possibility of evolutionary transformation, and an authoritarian turn. We leave to the side what Marx thought would be the possible outcome of an authoritarian turn, because eventually, at least in the French case, he came to experience it with the collapse of the Bonapartist system. But for the breakdown part of the course, this explanation would be the one that the tradition, which I wanted to introduce today, is going to try to replace. And the basic argument is that the outcome of possible democratic evolution to socialism, or if not, a possibility of a revolution in turn, is mediated by political systems, and these political systems involve political parties that organize, that vote. The vote is not simply an expression of popular opinion or of popular sentiments. It is also an expression. It is also one that is mediated by political organization, political communication, political publics, and political actors who become central in the maintenance of the existing system. So it is the party system, and this one can say, this one can affirm well into the 20th century, that represents a way of helping to avoid an ultimate tension between democracy and capitalism. What then becomes the task of the whole group of scholars collected by von Lintz is to describe this party system itself as a potential space in which a political crisis can occur. Now, in the kind of Marxian in the Marxian scheme, the economic crisis is fundamental. You see this still in Habermas, and the political crises represent either direct outcomes or forms of displacement of economic crisis tendencies. In my own view, I think all the three major contradictions of modernity can play a role, and this, I think, is also indicated by the structure of party systems, where political parties emerge sometimes around the wage labor capital relationship, in working class parties and capitalist parties being the main actors. But we can clearly see that party systems cannot, in many cases, be reduced to that. For example, in much of 20th century history, in fact, part of 19th century history, there are parties which are organized around national issues, organized around whether an ethnic minority or an ethnic majority that feels particular grievances with respect to either the political system or other political systems, other states, which represent threats or historical negative memories from their point of view. There are also religious parties, which is a ongoing phenomenon organized around purely cultural issues. And almost all times there are also parties which are organized around the very issue that I already mentioned, namely the tension between constitutionalism and democracy. Liberal party, the classical liberal party, defends the Constitution against democratic challenges, or for that matter, challengers who could be allied with socialist, or for that matter, nationalist groupings. And on the other side, the democratic parties are are ones which in some settings are organized around the extension of suffrage, and in other cases are organized around attempting to reform and transform oligarchic systems. So the formation of political parties is around not just one, but many contradictions, many possible tensions of modernity, which, depending on the electoral rule, will produce a certain number of parties, as we already can see in terms of first past the post the electoral rule, like the English American system. The tendency is toward two parties being exhausting the political sphere. Sometimes a third one appears and eventually displaces the second. This has occurred in several places. But a proportional representation allows the formation of parties around almost all the issues which I mentioned. So there are some settings in which you can point to constitutional, purely liberal parties. You can find parties which are organized almost around nothing but democratic inclusion and democratization, and then national issues, ethnic issues, religious issues, and of course socialist parties as well. In such political systems, the problem becomes how to organize a relatively effective government that can do anything. And some party systems make that easy. Other party systems make it more difficult. Adding the issue which Juan Linz has stressed from already this essay for many years after, the constitutional system too affects the ability of one or several parties to form effective government, presidential systems as against parliamentary systems. So depending on the constitutional system and depending on the electoral rules, you will have different party political frameworks which will mediate tensions, negotiate compromises, force polarization, generate policies, or just block policies. How this happens is the key for, I think, the literature that I'm dealing with to the breakdown problems. I would say that three or four categories are going to be important here. One category, Lynch stresses, is the category of the type of instauration. It's an awkward term, but maybe we don't have a better one for it. The way that a political constitutional order emerged in the first place, what he has in mind. How the thing emerged and what the founders have done affects everything else subsequently. That's sort of thesis number one. If they created a presidential system, let's say, to stay with Linz's own example, which creates separate elections for parliament or legislature and the presidency, there is the possibility of very strong government for such a system, but there's also a possibility of complete governmental deadlock. What Juan Linz thinks that it's especially a problem when the existing political structure is constitutionalized, because then even if the tensions between legislature and executive are producing tension after tension after tension, it becomes almost impossible to alter it. The legislature is not in position to change it through a simple law. In other systems, and I think in this sense, Linz has the British one in mind, it's relatively easy to alter dysfunctional long-term structures by simple legislation. So whether you constitutionalize the system in a very strong sense, like the United States has certainly done already in 1787, or you don't, and then what it is that you constitutionalize, is it presidentialism, is it parliamentarism, did you constitutionalize the electoral rule, which would mean that even when you're producing fragmentation after fragmentation, nevertheless, you can't make it more like, some countries, historically, a threshold has been introduced. Well, if you put the thing in the Constitution in the first place, you can. So what it is that you've done and how you have done it in the first place matters. The second thing I already talked about, but I would just mention it, is the problem of crisis. The problem of crisis matters because political actors, whatever the constitutional system, whatever the political parties, when they are under challenges they cannot meet, when inflation becomes so great that the purchasing power of all citizens is dramatically eroded, when unemployment becomes a fundamental problem that politicians cannot solve, the political parties themselves enter into potential crisis. So crisis matters, and what I think I need to add, a term comes from Klaus Offa, but it is one that should be used here. Crisis management matters too. Crises are part, as we know since Marx, a part of the overall history of capitalist development. Now, I'm using the term crisis in a broader sense than just Marx's economic crisis. But whatever the crises are, they could be, in principle, could be managed. Marx himself thought so, after all, because how do the crises end before capitalism enters into its final revolutionary period? The actors manage to do something. Ever since Keynes, we know some fundamental things about economic crisis management, deficit spending, elements of redistribution to prop up effective demand. In purely economic sense, there are possible ways of dealing, at least in a short term, with economic crisis. But when it comes to political crisis, we don't have such a neat Keynesian theory about how to deal with them. And political actors try to do it on their own. One way of doing it would be through giving power to some political authority temporarily to make decisions which the political actors themselves can no longer make. This is, for example, what the function of emergency institutions is. Emergency rule is one form of political crisis management. Another form, Lintz mentions it, is to take the most disruptive elements into the government. Crises are usually exploited by political actors. Why not just take them in? Why not give them a share of policymaking, or at least a share of the possible blame? So crisis calls for a possibility of crisis management, and authoritarian outcomes, just as I said in the case of the initial instauration, how certain forms of constitutional setup favor the possibility of breakdown. So certain forms of crisis management would do so as well. And finally, the most important part of the argument, and I think I'm going to try to conclude my presentation with this, but you read a lot of this in Lintz, and it will come back in the Valenzuela text, is the kind of actors who are involved. Now you have a constitutional structure That depends on how it was instituted, what its contents are. There are crisis phenomena which could be external to the political system, come from the economy, or for that matter, from the cultural domain too. And then there are the actors themselves, and how they respond is what is central for this analysis. This is where I think I was wrong last time when I said the causal dimension is not going to be our stress in this part, of course, because the actors are also causes. Now, it may be that you think that the scheme of von Lintz is overly simplistic and misleading, but I think it will serve at least our purposes here to repeat it, because he only introduces three types of actors who matter from the point of view of breakdown. In terms of simple, loyal, disloyal, and semi-loyal. Now, you have to realize that that in the 1970s, authors like Lintz and his generation, but even some of his students, are still dramatically influenced by the history of fascism, right? I mean, German National Socialism and indeed Italian fascism play a significant role for all of them. And von Lintz is the Spaniard, so for him, the Spanish breakdown, in which a fascist-type movement plays a significant role, is central too. For all these authors, fascism is in the back of their mind. Whether the model will work equally well for a case like Chile, we will have to see. But certainly, with respect to the older history of breakdowns, the distinction between loyal, disloyal, and semi-loyal actors. Let's start with the disloyal actors. No one has much doubt who the disloyal actors are in the time that Mussolini comes to power in Italy. It's the fascist movements who explicitly say they want to transform and abolish and replace the existing system. Disloyal actors are actors, by the way, by definition, who are not just challenging a government. They're challenging, and this is what the German National Socialists call it, the system, right? Another nice term for that is the regime. To replace a government, well, that's what every political party wants to do. That doesn't make them disloyal. The Republican Party, about which we can talk about from the point of view of disloyalty, semi-loyalty, and so on, but traditionally at least just wanted to replace the Democrats through electoral means and vice versa. The fact that you want to displace a government doesn't make you disloyal. The National Socialists in Germany, and we know this ever since Hitler's coup attempt in 1922 or 3, I'm not sure now the exact date of the coup attempt, wanted to replace the system of Weimar, which they understood to be both a product of foreign imposition and a conspiracy by certain political actors, especially the left. Weimar is a creation of the French and the socialists. I'm being very crude, right? But that's pretty much the level on which they thought of it. Yeah. And so the goal is to replace the system. There were other parties around who wanted to just replace the existing government. The National Socialists, and they're not necessarily the only ones, wanted to replace the system. And they keep on talking about the system, right? So a disloyal actor is the one who wants to replace the system, who doesn't accept the system under which they sometimes participate in elections, but they don't accept the system anyway. That's a disloyal actor. And a loyal actor is the one that defends the system, and to the extent that they want to politically gain, wants to replace the existing government, which means those parties that replace the other parties who are in government are, in this analysis, loyal actors. I ask the class a very tough question, but sometimes I do it. who are semi-loyal actors involved in this analysis? Semi-loyal actors.
Apparently loyal actors. Are these the apparently loyal actors that seem to repeatedly make concessions to the disloyal members?
Correct.
So they act as though they are loyal and they allow for sporadic violence.
So he gets it 100% right. Thank you, Adam. This is a good way to begin to show that these things are not inaccessible, right? That's exactly the answer, right? Semi-loyal actors are themselves participating in the system as if they were loyal, but they constantly make concessions to those who are disloyal, who want to replace the system. And then the next question, and Adam cannot answer it, for the breakdown, which of the three are the most significant? What?
Semi-loyal.
Okay, so he got it right, although it's a trick question because even one that can't get it completely right. In other words, there are times when he says the disloyal because they're the ones who then take power and so on. But I think the answer that you're giving is correct. It's an interesting thesis because it need not be true after all, right? I mean, it is imaginable that there is a setting in which the disloyal actors become a majority, and they become so powerful that they don't need any concessions from anybody else. But historically, that is not the case in Italy, in Germany, and now we're going to have to see whether this works for Chile as well. But in any case, for these historical cases, the argument would be that the loyal actors cannot be so loyal to democratic form as not to, at some point, try to repress those who want to overthrow the system by force, who are fundamentally disloyal to it. It's an interesting point, which I kind of disagree with, but I can see it, why they make it, is that a democracy, and maybe next time we should try to see how they define democracy, a democracy by which they mean a system which has open political contestation, alternatives, or even alternation in power, freedom of political participation and forming parties and all the rest. A system like that can actually exclude some actors from participation. I have some disagreement with that because the history of bans against communist parties, there was one in Chile, for example, that we will see in our discussion next time, are really ways not of reinforcing democratic system, but of just weakening the opposition. But still, I see the point because a constitutional system cannot be so completely tolerant as to accept everything that its enemies do. For example, the organization of militias which physically challenge, and this happens in lots of countries even now, which physically challenge the existing military or the existing political order with the goal of actually taking power through violent means, need not be permitted. And in this sense, loyal actors need not be need not eschew or surrender every possible repressive tool in order to protect democracy. When it comes, however, to the semi-loyal, and that's the point that you made, not only they do not want to use repressive means, for which there's sometimes a good argument, but they are also encouraged in terms of their journalistic and public relations efforts, and in terms of also making alliances on certain issues. And tendentially, in some settings, even taking them into government. That's the element of semi-loyalty. And I think you already gave the answer. Why would we think that it is semi-loyal actors who are the key to the problem of collapse? Well, because in order for the disloyal actors to be in a position to actually come to power, significant concessions are necessary to them. And these concessions at some point could go so far, and this is the maximum step in the historical cases are indicative, is the King of Italy offering the prime ministership to Benito Mussolini, or if you want, President originally Reichsmarshal Hindenburg offering the chancellorship to Adolf Hitler. Hindenburg is no fan of the Weimar democracy, but he is operating within its system, and in that sense, semi-loyalty is a good way of describing it. Initially, he gives the chancellorship to actors who he thinks will save democracy, indeed suppress the Nazis and the communists who are understood as a fundamental opposition. But in the end, he can be prevailed upon to give the chancellorship to Hitler. And the king in Italy, a roughly similar story. So the trick question, and I will end with this, it is the bridge to our next discussion. Who plays that role in Chile? There's several Latin Americans here, right? And so it's a little unfair, but I don't care who answers it. Whoever, they have a certain advantage. I want to have a certain advantage here in knowing this history of a country close to them. But who would play this role? It's a complex question. Not as easy. We're not going to find Hindenburg or the king as easily in the Chilean case. But something has to happen if this argument is to be right. And who is the relevant actor? Who are the relevant actors? Well, there could be two possible answers to that, right? One, the simplest would be the military. If you actually read the Valenzuela text, you'll see that the Chilean military is divided in terms of constitutionalists like General Prat, and then Golpista. What would be the plural of Golpista? Golpistas. So Golpistas like Pinochet eventually himself. And so when an organization is internally split like that, and dominance shifts from one side to the other, you could describe their role as that of a semi-legal. But this is not really the weight of the argument of Valenzuela will lie, because before this happens in the military, and this is basically the thesis of the whole school, something has to happen in the political parties. Which political party would be central from this point of view in Chile? Christian Democracy. Has to be Christian Democrats. There's no other candidate, right? No other candidate. It has to be the Christian Democrat. And that's really an interesting story.
I mean, but also Allende himself brings to the government 3 militaries.
We'll talk about it. Of course.
It's complex, but
That's another phenomenon, by the way, Lynch describes, namely attempting to crisis manage by giving power to a democratic, the Lynch terms, a democratic power. He did it twice, and thereby he politicized the military so much that the military was now ready to do it on its own. So Allende himself contributed. This is going to be our discussion. I'm glad that you're doing the job that we together assigned you. But of course, that there is a role for the system-friendly actor. In fact, there's a role for all the actors. because the system loyal actor manages the crisis in a bad way. And that's going to be, I even met his daughter. I have always incredible respect for the man, but you can't now, in retrospect, avoid the fact that he made really a lot of mistakes. That's just one of them. That's just one of them. We'll talk about that. I mean, I hesitate to talk about it. We have to learn from history, and we'll get to that. So you're right, Luis, raising that. But what about the Christian Democrats? The Christian Democrats themselves have, well, how does Allende even come to power? He's a minority president who has only a plurality, not a majority, and therefore cannot become president directly. So he must be elected by Congress. He has deputies on his own side, but it takes deputies from the center. That's going to be a key term here. Deputies from the center to elect him. That's the Christian Democrats. And the Christian Democrats have a wing which is a social reformist. And at that particular moment, they are still strong. And Allende comes to power through Christian Democratic votes. Given that that happens, he should have done things very differently than he actually did. But let's leave that for the moment to the side, because by the time the popular unity government gets to its late stage, the Christian Democrats are transformed from what one could call a system-friendly party, totally wedded to the system, both its wings, to a semi-loyal one, a semi-loyal party, because for their eventual majority and their new leadership elected in 1972 or 3, a couple of years into the government, the whole Allende government, and they vote accordingly in Congress, now trying to abolish the Constitution through the legal means. And so they turn not only against him, but begin to encourage system hostile elements. Mostly, I would say, in the military. So it is the shift of that party which becomes the fulcrum of this argument. And of course, there's a shift in the military too. General Prats is the commander-in-chief, and so constitutionalist military are in charge at a certain point, so much so that Allende can actually bring him into the government, but they lose control, and they lose control to a kind of internal military protest movement, which brings the hardliners to power. So it is these two components, and the simple actor model of loyal, semi-loyal, and disloyal doesn't quite work because the central actors become the ones who are internally split, who in a way incorporate the contradiction between loyalty and semi-loyalty. And it is they, or rather the shift of those actors from one pole to the other that produces the public support. Now, this is only very partial story for Chile. The reason I mention it is so that we have a bridge to our next discussion. In the case of Germany and Italy, would be more complex actors who played the same type of political role. But it is the shift of in this argument, the shift of some actors from loyalty to semi-loyalty, and sometimes even to disloyalty, that produces the political force, the political leadership, and to some extent even the popular support for for the ending of the democratic system. Let me stop at this point. There are, of course, a lot of things in the discussion that I have left out. I think you might have noticed, and I'm going to end with this, is that I added a new discussion for next week for this part of the course, or rather the part of the course that is reliant on von Lintz's analysis, and it has to do with the term re-equilibration. I added re-equilibration as a topic. What I think we should notice is that that whether or not the amount of force support for a authoritarian turn is there or not, there is at least in principle a chance to avoid an authoritarian outcome in this model, and the case that von Lintz was especially influenced by is the French Fifth Republic, namely the Fourth Republic on the verge of breakdown during the Algerian crisis. The military carry out a coup in Algeria itself, which could have become the beginning of a coup and a military regime in France. But through the emergence of de Gaulle's prime ministership, de Gaulle's leadership, that threat is averted, but by a pretty radical transformation of the structure of the Fourth Republic. So there is a possibility of re-equilibration, and in this literature, they try to give some cases in Latin America, Colombia, and Venezuela. In Europe, Finland are cases where there's an argument made for successful re-equilibration. France would have been the better example, but through the interrelationship of these various scholars, France got left out from the volumes, and other cases have been included. The question, though, arises with the example of Colombia, is how long a process of apparent breakdown can be for a re-equilibration to take place. For example, Colombia, in the analysis of Wild in one of these volumes, has a dictatorship for 9 years. So is it still re-equilibration if it's after 9 years that the system is reconstructed? So time will play an important role in our discussion next week. And that will be the same, not just for re-equilibration, but two additional possibilities: restoration and instauration again. That is, if you say, then in de Gaulle's case, there was never really, or in the French Fifth Republic case, there was almost not a moment of actual authoritarian rule. There was in Algeria, but it really actually controlled the territory. So the time can be almost zero for re-equilibration, and the time that, in the case of Colombia, could be 9 years. What about cases where dictatorship lasts longer? Would, for example, the restoration of democracy in Spain, while it's its own country, be called re-equilibration? Or is it restoration? Well, at least terminologically, they tend to use the term restoration when it's the earlier political form that is being restored. So the old constitution is once again made the constitutional structure, and instauration would be one in which the old constitution is not replaced, but a new one is created. Say in France, in 1945, they could have restored the Third Republic. That would have been a restoration. but instead they created a new structure. So in this model of cycles, we have to ask how long, and then what kind of process, and that means that re-equilibration, restoration, and a new constitutional synthesis represent three different options, which are in some ways time dependent. For re-equilibration, I think, even given this Colombian case, and Wilde in his essay does not use the term re-equilibration, because I think 9 years is too long for him to adopt the term. But still, for re-equilibration, we would say the time should be short. Would you have an authoritarian moment? Even with de Gaulle, you have it, by the way, because de Gaulle, when he accepts political power, also asks for decreed powers for a certain period. So a kind of semi-authoritarian interlude occurs even in France, but it's short. So re-equilibration is linked to a cycle which is very short. The authoritarian phase of it is short, and the democratic phase follows quickly thereafter. Restoration, you can restore a system. I mean, how long this was with Franco in power? 1938, 39 to Francoism in power till 1975, maybe, right? My dates are not good, but we're talking about now 35 years. Does it make sense to call something after 35 years a restoration? It doesn't. And the Spanish Republic created Spanish monarch, a constitutional monarchy, but it is a kind of republic created after 1975. It's a new system. It's not a restoration of the old republic. It's not even a republic technically, right? So the restoration is something that we can logically use for a relatively short period. I know historically the first term of restoration is the Bourbon Restoration, which is 1815 maybe. I'm not great on dates. Battle of Waterloo, whatever it is, defeat of Napoleon, Bourbon Restoration, 1815. The Bourbon monarchy collapses in 1793. That's 7 years, 22 years. Well, okay. Weirdly enough, the king is a potential monarch during the collapse of the monarchy. Louis XVIII is the younger brother of Louis XVI. So restoration seems to make sense for that. Technically, it is not the same system anymore. So re-equilibration, restoration, and a new synthesis, new constitution, instauration, the term used in this literature, represent cycles with a different time period, and we'll talk about those modalities in some detail next week. Okay. Questions, criticisms, comments. I know there's a lot of unclarity in my presentation because I try to combine too many things, and this way of linking economic, political, and cultural phenomena must be very unclear. It must be pretty obvious that it's plausible, at least, because after all, we naturally think that a severe enough economic crisis should bring down a political system too. After all of Marxism thinks that, right? So there's a link, that there should be a link between. And if you actually think about some cultural issues, when a society becomes violently divided over religion or ethnicity or relationship to its to neighboring states, it is not, going to surprise anyone that those conflicts, which are not per se economic or not immediately economic, could also bring down political systems. So that there should be such a link should not be a problem. But to make those links is hard. And it is to the credit of Marx that he did it for at least the economic. But I think the Linz group is right that to put the economic automatically first is not right. For example, I think Salvador Allende's government, I don't know if Luis is going to agree with this, has exacerbated the economic difficulties of Chile dramatically, right? So even if there are economic problems before, during those 3 years, they became dramatic. I know he doesn't want to, don't want to automatically accept it, but I think that at least it's plausible. It's not absurd to say that. Now you could say it is because of a capitalist investment strike. You could say because of the international influences on Chile, which the American ones are the ones which are central. So you could say that it is not strictly speaking the political tensions, but it is other phenomena that produce the economic crisis. But it is not it is not per se impossible to think that it is fundamental political tensions which make governing difficult and which therefore make economic crises either exacerbate them or make them very difficult to solve. So I think the linkage that Marx automatically, I think that the Marxian link is very plausible in the Chilean case. I don't want to say that the 18 Brumaire model would not be, you could not adapt it to Chile. But I think probably, it would be my hypothesis, if we take all the cases which might be relevant to this class, it would be better to assume that crises can come from different places and not just the economic. Okay. Yes. Okay. Please, but very loud so I hear you better.
Can you elaborate on which should be particular sovereignty in constitutional?
Okay. So from let us say, now that's of course the most fundamental level that I try to argue. So you can say that from the time of the French Revolution and some elements in the British Revolution, the idea of popular sovereignty becomes a significant notion in European history, and now I think it is international, right? I mean, there are very few places in the world, maybe Saudi Arabia would be one, where one could say that the reigning idea is not that ultimately the people should rule themselves. The popular sovereignty is that wherever there was a king before, a new actor should stand, namely the popular one. Now, how that actor acts is always a puzzle, of course. We assume either through elections or to direct participatory organs. Maybe some people would even say public relations polling. Doesn't matter how we know what the will of the people is. But in any case, it's an idea which is now almost an international part of international heritage, that in some ways that is the actor, a complex actor perhaps, a plurality of actors internally that should rule. But at the very same time, when that idea emerges, another idea emerges, which is the idea that all rules should take place under fundamental rules. That no one should rule that no one should rule without there being some rules which tell you how. Right? And so, if, for example, the people should rule through elections, we must have a system which has an electoral rule, and the people will not rule according to any which rule, they will rule under that. They will elect people under that rule. And or the electoral rule is not enough. No constitutionalist would say it's enough, because you need the possibility of a free discussion. You need the possibility of free action, not being punished for how you vote, free organization, so you can participate in elections on an equal basis with others who are already organized. So you need a whole set of rules. Sorry. That's my watch. It's connected to my phone. Okay, so you need something like a constitution. And that idea of constitutionalism emerges even before popular sovereignty, because there are people who think that even though the king should rule, not the people, the king too should rule under rules. And there are indeed some kings all over the world who give their population a constitution. Some constitutions are, in fact, the French term for it is octroyer. Octroyer is a German who impose a constitution, give a constitution, and thereby also limit themselves. So constitutionalism is an idea. It's in fact both popular sovereignty and constitutionalism are older ideas than the period I'm talking about. The Romans already begin to talk about popular sovereignty in some way. The medievals already talk about constitutional controls. Magna Carta, for example, is supposed to be a kind of contract, which the king also obeys. Okay, so these are two ideas. And what I said, and this is what you're asking me about, is that these two ideas are in tension. Because if the people rule, what does it mean that they should rule under some preset set of rules which they didn't necessarily make? Every single individual may participate in elections, but under rules that were made by their grandfathers, let's now say grandmothers too, right? It's not rules made by themselves. Thomas Jefferson, for example, thought for that reason that every generation should make a new one, because we should operate under rules, but rules which we make ourselves, not rules which grandparents make for us. So the two principles are in tension. And yet, in a way, one can develop both of them in such a way as to allow for that tension to be reduced. And to some extent, in all modern history, everywhere, all the way from United Kingdom to Japan, there are struggles around that particular question, and those struggles can lead to political organizations, political actors representing one principle against the other. The way I understand populism is that it is a defense of the popular sovereignty principle against constitutional restraints, against all constitutional restraints. And a lot of liberalisms historically have been pretty anti-democratic. But the people maybe can rule, but they rule within a straitjacket of rules. Yeah. And those rules are more important than the popular sovereignty principle. So you can have political organizations around those two principles, and under some conditions they battle, and under some conditions they manage to improve one another. That's the modern story of how these two principles can coexist, struggle, and perhaps lead to what? Well, democratization, right? Because from the point of view of popular sovereignty, you could say, well, electoral systems are really ways of electing oligarchies under constitutions. So constitutionalism is really oligarchism. That's one side can say that. Then the other side can say, yeah, yes, but populism is really a formula for arbitrary rule. Somebody speaking in the name of the people, it doesn't matter what person's name is, Bonaparte or Chavez or Trump, says to you, I'm your voice, so just listen to me. And so these two principles can be given very interpretations which are inimical to one another. And they can be given interpretations which are ways of improving one another. And that's the very long answer to your question. But political parties do form around that issue, and political conflicts occur around that issue. And think about your presentation a couple of weeks from now. What does it mean if someone says, I could not lose? It's impossible. If I lost an election, it must mean that it was rigged.
Yeah.
Right? And automatically to say that. And he's not the first one who has thought so. Now, of course, one of the things you do yourself is to rig the rules so that it cannot happen. And there are many, many cases of people doing that. Like Nicolas Maduro lost the election, so he says, well, but that's not the assembly that matters. We need to have another one, right? So you really try to control the outcomes and change the rules accordingly. But in some sense, both of these principles can be very fruitful for one another. So we need not be fatalistic that we're all going to be destroyed by that very tension. I think the issue is how they can be both developed without that tension becoming fatal. And so I would say that's the problem. And now, what occurs in some of our cases here is that the tension has become fatal. I don't want to say it's the only factor, because in some of the cases, the economic contradictions, think about the collapse of the economies, European economies, the Great Depression of 1929 and after. So certainly Hitler's rise to power would not occur without an economic crisis. But there's also this political problem of a political order which is understood or can be portrayed as no longer in any sense representing the people's will. And I will represent the people's will better, is the thing that the Hitler or Mussolini tells, first of all, their electorate, because they get a lot of votes. And then secondly, that's the story that is sold to some other power holders. So these tensions sometimes lead, and one could say the Chilean coup is just a coup of the military against the population. But I don't know if you'll disagree. Unfortunately, there is popular support for the right. Now, are they the people? Of course not. They're not. But is the other side the people? And that's a problem too. And I think, I don't want to say that Allende himself is, in some sense, guilty of the same thing that those who bring him down, because in my memory, he's such a positive figure, and we all revere him, or many of us do. But to go ahead with such a radical program of transformation on the basis of a minority presidency is a problem. It's a problem. We'll talk about it and debate it if you want next time. So this problem exists on not just on the side of the Hitlers and the Mussolinis, but on our own side too. Yeah, could Franklin Roosevelt pull it off? Well, he kind of did. And when he went too far with the court packing scheme, he had to also stop. But in any case, sometimes pushing the popular sovereignty side is positive. It's not necessarily destruction of the democratic order. But I think Roosevelt was loyal to the democratic order. That is, you would not take Franklin Roosevelt, in spite of the fact that he actually tried to monkey around with the constitutional structure. You would not say he's disloyal in the given. And Allende wasn't disloyal either. That's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that, though he was pushing the popular sovereignty side very, very far, he was still loyal to the constitutional structure. And in Allende's case, he thought he can do this legally. Well, maybe that was his downfall, some people would say, because you could have done what he wanted if you actually, lots of Chileans would have said that in 74, 75. I don't know, many of them say so now. But when the thing came down, lots of Chileans would say, well, yeah, of course, what did he think? He was going to do this legally? He was going to use the existing system to accomplish a social transformation? Of course not. You couldn't do it that way. So in that sense, they would say that the right would say he already was violating the Constitution, and some of the left would say he was not violating the Constitution enough.
Yeah.
I know that's your question. It's a very long answer to it, but I think Adam had his hand up too.
Yeah, there's a few references in the Linz text to Weber, and specifically to Weber's idea of charisma. And I'm struggling to understand what it means for Linz. It seems that sometimes that it's a neutral tool that can be used by a sort of actor, that at other times that it's a strictly a-democratic or anti-democratic tool. It's only used by, what's the term? Only used by the disloyal members. Is that reading correct? How do you think Linz uses charisma? Do you think that's the only way to use it? It seems like he's staying with this figure of the classic fascist leader that seduces his followers using his words.
You're going to have to find a passage because I don't quite remember his actual treatment of charisma. I'll look it up in a second. But let me use your question as a jump off exactly to another issue, which is related to it. Is that I think it's pretty fair to say that Linz is pretty much in a Weberian tradition, right? I mean, I use Marx as a kind of jump off point because Weber never actually faced this issue of how democracy can break down. I don't know, he might have commented on Marx's 18 Brumaire somewhere, or he might have thought about the issue at one point, but really, Weber doesn't take it up. It's not really a 19th century problem, except for that 18 Brumaire scenario of Marx. So Weber doesn't quite deal with the breakdown issue. But certainly, the master concept of Max Weber's legitimacy, and I know you're going in that direction, but I want to stop a little bit before we get to exactly your point. I think for one, Linz, legitimacy is indeed a master concept, and ultimately, I would say that even he didn't do this, didn't do it, but he could have done it. He could have linked up the loyal, disloyal, semi-loyal with the legitimacy problem. Clearly, democracy loyals are the ones who think the system is legitimate. I think Linz does do himself much of a service on actually defining legitimacy, where he seems to say that for a system to be legitimate, it means that that it is the least bad system. Is kind of Churchillian metaphor of the systems that I could imagine, which can serve my interest, or something like that. I think by legitimacy, he actually means this problem ultimately of loyalty. Those who are strongly loyal to a democratic system, in spite of crisis phenomena, in spite of dysfunctions, in spite of even insoluble issues, would say, but the system is legitimate. Whatever it is that we face, we should solve it within it. Because I know everybody stops before normative theory, but I don't have to. The idea is that this is the system that can be justified in normative terms. And even if it doesn't function all that well sometimes, I'm going to defend it. You know, this is the way the democratic actors speak in crisis moments. And there are people in this story, again, I'm back with Salvador Allende, who to whom would not be legitimate for normative reasons to try to enact a system on the basis of simply grabbing power with violence. And so that's the first issue. Now, what you're asking about, and then I think we can bring others into the discussion, Javier. What you're saying is that Linz seems to say that charisma is one of the ways of making something legitimate. Where is the actual passage where he raises it? See,
There's no one passage. It's briefly discussed at the bottom of 87, but it's really these very brief reference points where it's included in a list of strategies. And I was really concerned understanding, is it a unique kind of strategy? Is it normal? It's this.
I'm happy to go.
Yeah.
That's where you are, right? That discussion.
Yeah.
Well, that he very implicitly there. You're right. You're right. With de Gaulle, how does somebody? You're so right about this, right? But you're more Weberian in this sense than Linz himself, because he doesn't use the word charisma. But think about it. This system is collapsing. The military is rebelling. The parties can't function. And this guy, Big Charles, is even taller than me, 6'5" or something like that, comes around. But not only he comes around, the generals there say in Algeria, it's him, he's the one. And if you give power to him, we're willing to do X, Y, and Z. How could he pull that off? Well, it's so obvious, right? He's the leader of the resistance. The resistance has many leaders on the ground in the 1940s, but he is the titular head of it, the head of the Free French government, all the rest. He comes to power very briefly in 1945. Then he walks away from it because they don't accept his constitutional solution. That's very dramatic too, that somebody is willing to do that. Actually, it was a good sign that he could do it, because he did it again in '69. But in any case, clearly, if we have to pick a charismatic figure, it's him. And who can re-equilibrate? How can the thing be re-equilibrated in a moment of such a crisis? And the answer is leadership. That's what you picked up. And I think this is the way it has to be accounted for. But most of the time when it talks about legitimacy, it's not about this. It's unfortunately confused a little too much with effectivity and efficiency in Linz's actual argument. Javier.
I just was wondering now that Adam started mentioning about legitimacy, if you could speak more a little bit about the role of political violence, because Linz says that political violence is more important, not that much in acquiring power, but rather in the disintegration of the authoritarian regimes. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, and also the role of social mobilization, because we saw in the lesson of fascism how fascism is ultimately a democratic mobilization against democracy itself. And I don't think Linz necessarily speaks too much about political mobilization of the masses necessarily within this text. He identifies these actors.
Okay, let me deal with with these separately, because violence he does mention, and his argument is that violence is a very serious problem in the problem breakdown, but it is not the violence that brings it down. That's again a question which is very much a position which is very much influenced by his historical relationship to National Socialism and to fascism. We know that they were violent movements. We know they had militias committing acts of atrocities against other people, political and social actors. But they did not take power to the direct use of that, he said. This works pretty well for the two fascist cases. It doesn't really work too well for Chile, right? I mean, think about how Valenzuela's book begins. Hopefully, the people have already picked it up. It's available now, I think, Valenzuela's Chile volume. We haven't made it available yet?
No.
I think we have. In any case, it will be after this afternoon because we need it for Wednesday. It begins with the attack on the Moneda Palace, right? So, I mean, violence is clearly the instrument of bringing it down. And would it have been brought down had there been no military violence used? Who knows? Might not have worked, but maybe the Christian Democrats would have made a compromise at some point down the line, and it could have been re-equilibrated, as the word has it, right? So the reason why de Gaulle wins and Allende loses, in some sense, is because the holders of violence respected de Gaulle and were willing to accept re-equilibration under his leadership. And the holders of violence, except for General Prat and maybe a few other generals, did not accept Allende's legitimacy. So obviously, Linz should have differentiated this issue, saying, oh, yeah, I think I mentioned you, Javier, should have been a little more careful. Violence is both a reason for the dysfunction and can be the instrument of bringing it down. Depends. So that's sort of the first question. But popular mobilization and violence seem to be related, but they're not really the same issue. Because you could say that that mass movements can exercise a tremendous amount of force, and that is, of course, possible in some cases. I think you can say that in the case of, let us say, the collapse of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, that given the mobilization of people on the street, there was no way that the thing could have been saved. Maybe East Germany is also like that. So sometimes popular force is like acts in a way that perhaps violence would. That is rare. In these cases, in the German, Italian, Chilean case, so far we're only with them, you could say that there's tremendous mass mobilization, and mass mobilization on two sides. Chilean case, not only the famous women's pots and pans, but trucker strike, all kinds of strikes, strike movements on both sides. So there is mobilization on both sides, but this creates only a power vacuum or a kind of ungovernability context in which no one is able to resolve the crisis. For example, a strike movement makes it very difficult to deal with economic crisis phenomena, because it means the strikers are in a position to make demands for themselves, and the economic re-equilibration would require other kinds of measures. So I think that popular movements play a big role in these breakdowns. I don't know if there's any breakdown without some popular mobilization. Now, whether it's always two-sided, I can't swear to that. But at least on one side, popular mobilization cannot be controlled. And I think you're right in asking about that together with violence, because both can represent system problems that a government cannot solve. Violence because the government is unable to create order. And popular mobilization because the government is unable to undertake whatever policies the mobilization is challenging. For example, economically oriented mobilization, the government is unable to carry out economic measures, which sometimes are tough. So in a sense, ungovernability and power vacuums can be caused by both of the issues you raise, both violence and popular mobilization. And of course, they can be together, right? Popular mobilization and violence can be even linked phenomena. In the case of, for example, the German National Socialism, their popular demonstrations and mobilizations are often linked to acts of violence by the SA and other paramilitary organs. But that is on the level of the creation of system problems. And then the next issue of what actually brings down the regime, the precipitation of a final breakdown. There, I think violence can play a more important role than Lynch thinks, and I think more important role than popular movements too. I mean, this is kind of strange on this part, because if you actually look away from Germany and Italy, where violence is a system problem, but it is not the actual precipitation of the change. If you look at Latin America, I mean, all the coups indicate that violence is much more significant historically. Now, are all the coups equally violent? Well, no, not necessarily, but they are all violent acts, right? I mean, people are removed from political office by force, people are jailed, people are forced into exile. So coups are violent, and so in that sense, I would say violence is part of the. I think that he's so much under the influence of fascism that he kind of thinks that violence is a problem, but it is not the precipitation. Or is it time?
Yeah.
It is time. Okay, so for the time being, then no, for the time being, you're gonna have to. Here's the problem with the doodle pool. You all have to answer it. He's gonna send it out to you, but the unless you answer it